the great weaving hall of Caledonian Textile Mills fell silent for the first time in decades. The clatter of 100 looms ceased, as if the building itself held its breath. Beneath the high iron rafters, Hamish MacLeod lay motionless, his skull crushed beneath a massive bolt of freshly woven tartan. 60 pounds of crimson and forest green cloth that had tumbled from the top storage rack like a thunderbolt from angry gods. Blood seeped into the intricate pattern, turning Royal Stuart into something far darker. No one had seen it fall. No one had heard a cry. Only the dull, final thud. And yet, Hercule Poirot, visiting Glasgow at the invitation of an old friend, felt the little grey cells stir. This was no accident. Accidents, after all, are so rarely perfect. Chapter 1. Arrival in the rain. The train from London eased into Glasgow Central with a long, weary sigh of steam, as though even the engine resented the relentless downpour that greeted it. Hercule Poirot, impeccable as ever in his pinstriped suit, fur-collared overcoat and glossy patent leather shoes, stepped down onto the platform with the cautious precision of a man who regarded puddles as personal enemies. In one gloved hand he carried a small valise, in the other a tightly furled umbrella that he now unfurled with a decisive snap. The rain drummed upon the silk canopy like impatient fingers. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a sodden bowler hat approached through the haze of smoke and vapour. His moustache drooped under the weight of water, and his trench coat shone like sealskin. "Monsieur Poirot," he called over the hiss of escaping steam. "Inspector James McAllister, Glasgow Constabulary. I'm right glad you've come, sir." Poirot inclined his head with courteous gravity. "Enchanté, Inspector, though I regret that our meeting must be under such melancholy circumstances." McAllister gestured toward a waiting black Austin saloon. "Aye, melancholy's the word. Hamish MacLeod, owner of the Caledonian Textile Mills, dead yesterday morning, crushed by a 60-pound bolt of tartan that fell from the top rack in the weaving hall. Looks like a tragic accident, but the family's kicking up a fuss, claiming murder. And since you were already planning to visit your old friend Sir Andrew MacGregor in Edinburgh, we thought, well, we hoped you might spare us a day or two." Poirot permitted himself the faintest of smiles. "The little grey cells, Inspector, are always at the service of justice. And I confess, a death beneath falling tartan possesses a certain symmetry that intrigues me." They motored northward through streets that gleamed like polished obsidian. Glasgow, in the grip of winter rain, wore a coat of slate and soot. Factory chimneys rose like dark fingers against the low sky, and the air carried the acrid tang of coal smoke mingled with the faint, greasy scent of lanolin from the woolen mills along the Clyde. Poirot gazed out at the passing tenements, their windows glowing with gaslight, and at the clusters of muffled figures hurrying beneath umbrellas the colour of wet ravens. "Tell me of Monsieur MacLeod," Poirot said at length. McAllister kept his eyes on the slippery road. 58 years old, self-made. Started as a loom tuner's apprentice and built Caledonian Mills into one of the biggest tartan producers in Scotland. Exported to Canada, America, even Japan. Hard man, mind. Drove his workers mercilessly and his family harder still. Talk was he planned to install new electric looms, which would put half the workforce out of a job. Caused no end of bad feeling. And the family. Only nephew, Alistair Baird, his sister's boy. 32, handsome enough, but a gambler and a spendthrift. Lives beyond his allowance. MacLeod kept him on a tight leash. Then there's Miss Fiona Drummond, the mill manager, sharp as a tack, been with him 15 years. Loyal, they say, though some whisper more than loyal, and the workers look to Morag Kerr, head weaver and Union firebrand. She and MacLeod were at daggers drawn over conditions. Poirot stroked his magnificent moustaches thoughtfully. Already we have motives in abundance: greed, fear of unemployment, thwarted affection, class resentment, and the method, a falling bolt of cloth. How poetic for a textile magnate! The car turned onto a broad riverside road where the great red brick bulk of Caledonia Textile Mills loomed through the rain. 4 stories high, with rows of tall windows now dark and silent, it crouched beside the Clyde like some industrial cathedral. Even from the gateway, Poirot could sense the unnatural stillness. No rhythmic thunder of looms, no shouts of overseers, only the mournful cry of gulls and the ceaseless hiss of rain on cobblestones. A knot of workers sheltered beneath the archway, flat caps pulled low, faces pale and watchful. They parted reluctantly to let the car pass. McAllister parked in the yard, and Poirot emerged beneath his umbrella into air thick with the smell of wet wool and machine oil. The weaving hall was a vast cavern of iron pillars and overhead shafting. Hundreds of looms stood in silent ranks like soldiers at ease, their harnesses still threaded with half-woven tartans of scarlet, emerald, and royal blue. High above, on galleries and storage racks, bolts of finished cloth were stacked in precarious towers. Gas lamps had been lit against the gloom, casting long shadows that danced whenever a draught stirred the suspended drive belts. In the centre of the aisle, outlined in chalk upon the oiled wooden floor, lay the shape of a man. Above it, on the topmost rack 20 feet up, a dark gap showed where one massive bolt had fallen. The bolt itself, 60 pounds of densely rolled Royal Stuart tartan, had been removed to the side and covered with a clean sheet, but a dark stain still spread across the floorboards beneath. Poirot stood motionless for a long moment, absorbing every detail. Then, with the neat, deliberate movements that characterized him, he approached the chalk outline. He knelt, careful of his trousers, and examined the floor minutely. A few threads of crimson wool adhered to cracks between the boards. A single brass button lay half hidden in shadow. MacLeod was alone when it happened? He asked. Aye. He always did his morning inspection at precisely 17 minutes past 9, walking the same path between the looms. Workers were just starting up. Vibration from the belts might have shaken the bolt loose. No one saw it fall, only heard the thud. Poirot rose and turned his attention to the iron ladder bolted to the nearest pillar. It led up to the storage gallery. Fresh scratches marred one rung, bright against the rust. He produced a pocket tape measure and calculated distances with absorbed concentration. The bolt rested at the very edge, he murmured. Perfectly balanced, one might say. A heavy lorry passing outside, the starting of the looms, any vibration could dislodge it, and yet... His green eyes gleamed. It falls straight down, striking Monsieur MacLeod precisely upon the crown. Had he been one pace to left or right, he would have escaped with bruises only. Such precision in an accident is rare. McAllister shifted uncomfortably. The foreman swears the racks were secure, but things loosen over time. Indeed, Poirot said softly, things loosen, or are loosened. He turned as 4 figures emerged from the shadows at the far end of the hall. A tall woman in her 40s, auburn hair drawn severely back, wearing a navy coat over a practical tweed skirt. A younger man, elegantly dressed but with restless eyes and a cigarette trembling between his fingers. An older woman with iron-grey hair and hands scarred by decades at the loom, and a quiet, broad-shouldered man in oil-stained overalls clutching a spanner. "Allow me to present the interested parties," McAllister said. "Miss Fiona Drummond, mill manager. Mr. Alistair Baird, the nephew. Mrs. Morag Kerr, head weaver. Mr. Lachlan Shaw, chief engineer." Each acknowledged Poirot with varying degrees of wariness, grief, and defiance. The air between them crackled with unspoken accusations. Poirot surveyed them calmly, his small, neat figure somehow dominating the vast hall. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said at last, his English flawless but richly accented, "a man has died beneath the very fabric that made his fortune. The police call it accident. You, I think, do not all agree. Hercule Poirot will discover the truth. For truth, like good tartan, is woven of many threads, and none shall be hidden from me." In the silence that followed, rain lashed the high windows like thrown gravel, and somewhere in the rafters a loose belt flapped mournfully. Chapter 2. The Four Suspects. The mill office was a small panelled room on the first floor, reached by a narrow iron staircase that rang beneath Poirot's measured footsteps. It smelled strongly of ink, ledger paper, and the faint, persistent lanolin that clung to everything in the building. A gas fire hissed in the grate, throwing restless shadows across walls lined with pattern books, hundreds of them, bound in faded tartan cloth, each containing meticulous samples of every design the Caledonian mills had ever woven. Inspector McAllister closed the door firmly behind them, shutting out the hollow echo of the empty weaving hall. The four suspects were already seated around a heavy oak table. Fiona Drummond opposite the fire, her posture erect and composed. Alistair Baird slouched to her left, turning an unlit cigarette between nervous fingers. Morag Kerr on the right, arms folded tightly across her chest, and Lachlan Shaw standing a little apart by the window, gazing out at the rain-swept yard as though he wished himself elsewhere. Poirot took the remaining chair with deliberate care, placing his hat and gloves upon the table, like instruments ready for use. He regarded each face in turn, his small green eyes bright and unblinking. "Mesdames, messieurs," he began, his voice precise and courteous, "we are gathered in sorrowful circumstances. Monsieur Hamish MacLeod is dead. The police incline toward accident, yet doubt has been expressed, sufficient doubt that I, Hercule Poirot, have been summoned from London. I shall ask questions, some may be uncomfortable. But truth, she demands candour." He paused, allowing the silence to settle. "Let us commence with facts. Miss Drummond, you are manager of this mill?" Fiona inclined her head. Her voice was low, controlled with the crisp accent of educated Glasgow. "I have been for 12 years. Mr. MacLeod trusted me with day-to-day operations." "And he spoke to you of changes? New machinery?" Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly upon the edge of the table. "He did. Electric looms from Lancashire. Faster, more efficient, but they require fewer workers. He intended to install them next spring." Alistair Baird gave a short, bitter laugh. Uncle Hamish was obsessed with progress. Never mind that half the town depends on this place for bread. Poirot turned to him. "You are the nephew, heir presumptive." Alistair met his gaze with an attempt at carelessness that did not quite succeed. "Presumptive is the word. Uncle kept me on a quarterly allowance, barely enough for a gentleman to live decently. Said gambling was my weakness, and he wouldn't feed it. I'm 32, Monsieur Poirot. Most men my age control their own fortunes." "Yet you live in hope of inheritance." "Hope," Alistair repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, one lives in hope." Morag Kerr leaned forward, her weathered face flushed, "while the rest of us live in fear. MacLeod treated his workers like cogs in his machines. 12-hour shifts, lungs full of fluff, wages that barely keep body and soul together. I told him to his face at the last meeting. If he brought in those new looms without proper provision for the displaced, there'd be trouble. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Trouble, madam? Of what nature? The kind that comes when folk are pushed too far, she replied steadily. Strikes, sabotage perhaps, but not murder. We fight openly. Lachlan Shaw spoke for the first time, his voice quiet, with the soft burr of the Highlands. I maintain the machinery. If there was sabotage, I'd have seen signs. Belts cut, bearings tampered with. There was nothing. Poirot turned to him with interest. You checked the storage racks recently, monsieur? A week ago, all secure. And yet a 60-pound bolt falls with fatal precision. Poirot's tone remained mild, curious. He reached into his pocket and produced a folded sheet of paper, which he smoothed upon the table. It was one of the anonymous notes the inspector had mentioned. Cheap paper, typed in uneven capitals. Cease the new looms or pay the price. Justice is heavy. This was pushed under Monsieur MacLeod's office door 10 days ago. There have been 3 others, all typed upon the mill's only typewriter, which resides, I understand, in the manager's office. Fiona Drummond's expression did not change. The office is unlocked during working hours. Anyone might use the machine after hours. Cleaners, night watchmen, union representatives preparing notices. Morag Kerr nodded. I've typed many a leaflet on that machine, but I sign my name to what I write. Alistair flicked ash from his unlit cigarette. Rather dramatic, isn't it? Justice is heavy. Sounds like something from a penny dreadful. Or from someone familiar with the weight of tartan bolts, Poirot observed gently. Silence fell again, thicker now. Rain lashed the window panes, and somewhere below a loose shutter banged repeatedly. Poirot leaned back, steepling his fingers. Let us consider opportunity. At 17 minutes past 9 yesterday morning, Monsieur MacLeod walked his habitual path through the weaving hall, alone, because the looms had not yet started, and the workers were at their stations preparing. No one admits to being present in that aisle, and yet someone must have been near enough to hear the fatal thud and raise the alarm moments later. He looked at each in turn. Miss Drummond, you were in this office? Yes, preparing the day's production schedule. Mrs. Kerr, with the weavers in the spinning room? Aye, showing the new girls how to piece broken threads. Mr. Baird, you were... Alistair shrugged. Across the river at the Saracen's Head. Breakfasting with friends, I often do. And you, Mr. Shaw? In the boiler room, checking steam pressure before start-up. Almost convenient, Poirot murmured. 4 alibis, each solitary, and all within easy reach of the weaving hall. He rose smoothly. For the here and present, that is sufficient. But I shall wish to speak with each of you again privately, and I shall examine the premises further. The little grey cells, they require nourishment. As the others filed out, Poirot lingered by the notice board in the corridor outside. Pinned there, almost hidden beneath shift rotors and union announcements, was a single sheet. A crude pencil drawing of a bolt of cloth falling upon a stick figure. Beneath, in the same uneven capitals as the threatening notes, justice is heavy. Poirot studied it for a long moment, then carefully removed the pin and folded the paper into his pocket. Outside, the rain continued to fall without mercy, drumming upon the slate roof like a warning. Somewhere in the vast building, a door slammed, and footsteps echoed away into silence. Hercule Poirot adjusted his hat, drew on his gloves, and descended the iron stairs toward the weaving hall once more. The truth was here, hidden among the silent looms and towering bolts of tartan. Chapter 3. The Scene of the Crime. Dusk had fallen early over Glasgow, as it always did in December, and the great weaving hall of Caledonian Mills lay wrapped in shadow and silence. The gas lamps along the walls had been turned low, their flames hissing softly like distant serpents. Outside, the rain had eased to a cold mist that drifted between the buildings and blurred the lights of the riverside into halos of sickly yellow. Hercule Poirot moved alone through the vast space, his footsteps muffled by the oiled floorboards. He had dismissed Inspector McAllister with a polite but firm assurance that the little grey cells functioned best in solitude. The looms stood around him like ranks of sleeping giants, their wooden frames and iron fittings gleaming faintly. Overhead, the drive shafts and leather belts hung motionless, yet Poirot could almost feel the memory of their thunderous rhythm vibrating in the air. He walked slowly along the chalk-marked path that Hamish MacLeod had taken at 9:17 the previous morning. Step by measured step, he retraced the dead man's final journey, past the silent ranks of Northrop looms. Beneath the high storage galleries, where the bolts of finished tartan waited in towering stacks. At the exact spot marked by the chalk outline, he paused, head tilted, eyes half closed as though listening to an inaudible conversation. Then he knelt, again with meticulous care for his immaculate trousers, and examined the floorboards anew. The dark stain had been scrubbed by the cleaners, but faint traces remained, soaked deep into the grain. A few threads of crimson wool still clung stubbornly to the cracks. Poirot produced a small magnifying lens from his waistcoat pocket and studied them intently. "Royal Stuart set," he murmured to himself. "The very bolt that killed him. 60 pounds of cloth, rolled tight as a cannonball. It fell from directly above. No deviation, no roll. Straight down, like the judgment of fate." Rising, he turned his attention to the iron ladder, bolted to the nearest pillar. It rose 20 feet to the narrow gallery where the fatal bolt had rested. The ladder was old, pitted with rust, yet one rung, about halfway up, showed bright scratches, as though something hard had scraped across it recently. Poirot climbed with surprising agility for so compact a man, testing each rung carefully. At the top, he stepped onto the gallery, a precarious walkway barely wide enough for one person, lined on one side by stacked bolts of tartan, and on the other by a low rail. He moved along it slowly, gloved hands brushing the edges of the remaining bolts. Most were pushed well back, secure. But in the place where the fatal bolt had sat, there remained only a rectangular gap. Poirot took his pocket tape measure once more and calculated distances. From the edge of the shelf to the rail, from the rail to the floor below, the angle of fall. "Perfectly vertical," he whispered. "No deflection. The bolt sat upon the very lip of the shelf, balanced with exquisite precision. A vibration, perhaps the starting of the great engine in the basement, would suffice to tip it over. And yet, why this bolt alone? Why not its neighbours?" He leaned out cautiously over the rail, peering down at the chalk outline far below. From this height the floor appeared a distant map, the chalk figure tiny and pathetic. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he visualized the trajectory. A straight plunge, striking MacLeod precisely upon the crown of the head. Had he been 1 foot, one single foot, to the left or right, Poirot said softly, he would have survived. Such accuracy in an accident is improbable. A faint sound disturbed the silence. The creak of a door at the far end of the hall. Poirot turned sharply. A figure stood silhouetted against the dim light from the corridor, broad-shouldered, motionless. "Mr. Shaw," Poirot called calmly, "you could not sleep either." Lachlan Shaw stepped forward into the lamplight, his face pale beneath a day's stubble. He still wore his oil-stained overalls, as though he had never left the mill. "No," he admitted. "I keep seeing it in my mind. That bolt coming down. I keep asking myself if I missed something in the fittings." Poirot descended the ladder with care and approached the engineer. "A conscientious man. It is admirable. You checked these racks yourself last week, you said?" "Aye, all brackets tight, I swear it. And yet one bolt falls." Poirot's tone remained mild, almost conversational. "You were in the boiler room at the time of the accident." Shaw nodded. "Checking gauges. Alone, as usual, before startup." "Alone," Poirot repeated gently. "Most convenient for an alibi. Or most inconvenient, depending on one's perspective." Shaw's hands clenched at his sides. "I had no reason to harm Mr. MacLeod." "None at all?" Poirot asked, head tilted. "Not even if he threatened the position of someone you admire? Miss Drummond, perhaps, whose job might have been endangered by the new machinery?" A flush rose in Shaw's cheeks. "That's none of your affair. On the contrary, monsieur. When a man dies, everything becomes the affair of Hercule Poirot." Shaw turned abruptly away, but not before Poirot noticed the tension in his shoulders. The engineer strode toward the side door, boots echoing sharply. Poirot watched him go, then returned his attention to the floor beneath the ladder. Something glinted there in the lamplight. A small object half hidden in a patch of congealed machine oil. He knelt once more and carefully retrieved it with tweezers from his pocket. It was a brass button, large and heavy, engraved with the MacLeod clan crest, a bull's head above a ribbon bearing the motto, "Hold fast." The thread attached to it was fresh, torn rather than worn. Poirot turned the button over in his gloved palm, eyes gleaming. "This was not here this afternoon," he murmured. "Someone has been careless." He slipped the button into an envelope, then stood listening. The hall had fallen silent again, save for the distant drip of water somewhere in the rafters and the faint moan of wind around the high windows. Yet Poirot felt certain he was not alone. Somewhere in the shadows between the looms, someone watched, someone who had dropped this button deliberately, or by accident. He adjusted his overcoat, drew on his gloves more snugly, and walked toward the main doors with his usual neat precision. But at the threshold he paused and spoke aloud into the emptiness. "Take care, mon ami. Hercule Poirot does not like to be played with. And buttons are such revealing things." Then he stepped out into the mist, pulling the great doors closed behind him with a solemn thud that echoed through the vast hall like the closing of a tomb. Chapter 4. Secrets in Pattern Books. Morning light, thin and grey, filtered through the high windows of Hamish MacLeod's private office on the top floor of the mill. The room was austerely furnished. A broad mahogany desk, glass-fronted cabinets filled with pattern books, a large safe in one corner, and a single framed photograph of the mill in its early days, when MacLeod himself still stood among the looms. The air carried the faint dry scent of old paper and the sharper tang of ink from the ledgers that lay open upon the desk. Hercule Poirot sat in MacLeod's high-backed chair, gloved fingers turning pages with delicate precision. Inspector McAllister had granted him full access. The door was locked against interruption. On the blotter before him lay the dead man's appointments diary, its entries written in a bold, impatient hand. Poirot read slowly, absorbing every detail. The final weeks revealed a man under pressure, meetings with bankers in Edinburgh, correspondence with the Lancashire firm supplying the new electric looms, notes of increasingly heated exchanges with Morag Kerr and the Union Committee. and in the margin of one page, a single terse line. A.B. again, refuse. Poirot's moustaches twitched in satisfaction. A.B. Alistair Baird. He turned next to the ledgers. The mill's accounts were meticulously kept. Fiona Drummond's work, no doubt. Profits had been steady but were now declining. Foreign competition was biting hard. Modernization was essential for survival. Yet the cost of the new machinery would plunge the business deeply into debt for several years. MacLeod had underlined certain figures in red, adding stern annotations, cut staff costs and no further advances. Poirot closed the ledger and moved to the desk drawers. Most were unlocked and yielded nothing of interest. The bottom drawer, however, resisted. A small but sturdy lock. Poirot produced from his pocket a slender tool of polished steel. A little indulgence he permitted himself. And within moments the drawer slid open. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with pale blue ribbon. Poirot untied it carefully. The paper was heavy, scented faintly with lavender. The handwriting graceful and feminine. My dearest Hamish, 15 years I have stood at your side, sharing every burden of this place. Do you not see that my devotion goes beyond duty? I would give anything, everything, for a sign that you feel even a fraction of what I feel for you. There were a dozen such letters, growing increasingly desperate in tone, all signed simply F. Fiona Drummond. Beneath them lay a single reply in MacLeod's bold script, dated only a month earlier. My dear Fiona, your loyalty to the mill has been invaluable, and I am sensible of the personal warmth you offer. But affection must not cloud business judgment. The changes ahead will require hard decisions, decisions I must make alone. Let us preserve the professional understanding that has served us so well. H. Poirot replaced the letters exactly as he had found them, his expression grave. Love turned to resentment. How often had he seen it become the seed of murder? A soft knock sounded at the door. Poirot rose and admitted Fiona Drummond herself. She carried a tray with coffee and oatcakes, an excuse, plainly, to see what he was about. I thought you might require refreshment, Monsieur Poirot, she said coolly. You are most considerate, mademoiselle. He accepted a cup but did not drink. You manage this office as well as the mill. I kept the books, yes. Mr. MacLeod trusted me implicitly. Poirot gestured to the photograph on the wall. A remarkable rise, from apprentice to owner. Her gaze softened momentarily. He worked night and day. Nothing was ever enough. And yet he planned changes that would displace many workers. Did that not trouble you? She set down the tray with deliberate care. Progress always has a price. I tried to persuade him to offer retraining, generous severance. He refused. Refused firmly. Very firmly. Her voice was steady, but Poirot noted the slight tightening of her lips. He moved to the window, looking down upon the yard where workers were beginning to gather for the morning shift. And personally, mademoiselle, did he refuse other things also? For the first time her composure flickered. I don't know what you mean. Poirot turned, eyes bright. Come, come. A woman of your intelligence. 15 years of closeness. One does not need to be Hercule Poirot to see what is plain. Colour rose in her cheeks, but she met his gaze. Whatever there was, or was not, between Mr. MacLeod and myself is private. Until he dies violently, mademoiselle, then everything becomes public. She turned away sharply. I did not kill him. Perhaps not, Poirot said softly, but someone who cared for you deeply might have feared for your position or acted from jealousy. Fiona left without another word, closing the door with quiet finality. Poirot returned to the desk and opened the appointments diary again. A small slip of paper had been tucked between pages. A bill from a London bookmaker addressed to Alistair Baird for the sum of £8,000, due immediately. In the margin, MacLeod had scrawled, "Final warning, no more. Greed, then, as well as thwarted love." Downstairs, Poirot sought out Morag Kerr among the weavers. She was instructing a group of young girls at a warping mill, her strong hands guiding theirs with rough kindness. When she saw Poirot approaching, she dismissed the girls and faced him squarely. "Found your murderer yet, little man?" "Not yet, madame, but I find the human heart a complex pattern, much like your tartans." She gave a short laugh. "Pretty words won't feed hungry bairns when the new looms come. You fought hard against them." "Aye, and I'd fight harder still. But fair and open. I've no need for skulking and anonymous notes." Poirot studied her calloused hands. "You have access to the manager's office after hours, for union business?" "When needed, but I told you, I sign my name to my battles." He nodded thoughtfully. "Yet someone prefers anonymity." As he walked away, Poirot noticed fresh marks in the dust near the base of the iron ladder, footprints in machine oil, leading from the ladder toward the side door. Size 10 boots, broad, with a distinctive worn patch on the left heel. Both Alistair Baird and Lachlan Shaw, he recalled, wore size 10. The net was drawing tighter. But the true shape of the crime remained elusive, hidden among the myriad threads of motive and opportunity. Poirot paused at the great doors, breathing in the familiar scents of wool and oil and human endeavour. Somewhere within this building, a killer walked free, confident, perhaps, that accident would shield him. But Hercule Poirot was not deceived by appearances. And the little grey cells were already reared, beginning to weave the pattern of truth. Chapter 5. The Will Reading. The Boardroom of Caledonia. Textile mills occupied a long, narrow space on the second floor, its walls panelled in dark oak and hung with portraits of previous owners, stern Victorian gentlemen with whiskers and watch chains. A single long table dominated the centre, polished to a deep gleam and surrounded by 12 leather-upholstered chairs. Rain still beat against the tall windows, turning the view of the Clyde into a grey blur, while a coal fire crackled in the grate, throwing restless light across the assembled faces. Hercule Poirot sat at the foot of the table, small and immaculate, his hands folded neatly before him. Inspector McAllister stood by the door, solid and watchful. The 4 principal interested parties had been summoned. Fiona Drummond, composed in a charcoal grey costume, Alistair Baird, whose morning suit appeared slightly rumpled as though slept in, Morag Kerr, defiant in her Sunday best, and Lachlan Shaw, uncomfortable in a stiff collar, standing rather than sitting as though ready for flight. At the head of the table sat Mr. Archibald Campbell, the family solicitor from Edinburgh, tall, gaunt and dry as winter leaves. He placed a Morocco leather folder upon the table with solemn deliberation, and cleared his throat. "We are here," he began in precise legal tones, "to read the last will and testament of Hamish Alasdair MacLeod, dated the 23rd of November last, and witnessed by myself and my clerk." Alistair Baird leaned forward eagerly. Fiona stared fixedly at the table. Morag Kerr folded her arms. Lachlan Shaw looked at none of them. Mr. Campbell adjusted his spectacles and began. The preliminaries were brief. Small bequests to long-time servants, a donation to the Glasgow Seamen's Orphanage, a few minor legacies. Then came the substance. I give, devise, and bequeath the entirety of my estate, including the Caledonian Textile Mills, its lands, buildings, machinery, and goodwill, as follows. To my nephew, Alistair Hamish Baird, the sum of £5,000, to be held in trust until he attains the age of 35 years, and can demonstrate to my trustees a period of 12 consecutive months, without incurring gambling debts. Should he fail to meet this condition by his 40th birthday, the capital shall revert to the secondary bequest. The residue of my estate, including full ownership and control of Caledonian Textile Mills, I divide equally between Miss Fiona Isabel Drummond and a workers' trust to be administered by Mrs. Morag Kerr on behalf of all current employees, with provision for retraining and generous severance in the event of future mechanization. A stunned silence fell. Alistair Baird went deathly pale, then flushed crimson. "This is outrageous! He can't! He promised!" Mr. Campbell regarded him over his spectacles. "He did no such thing, Mr. Baird. Your uncle altered his previous will precisely 3 weeks ago, after receiving certain information regarding your indebtedness. I have the revocation of the earlier document here." He tapped a second folder. Fiona Drummond sat as though turned to stone, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Only the slightest tremor in her cheek betrayed emotion. Morag Kerr exhaled slowly, her eyes bright. He listened then. In the end, he listened. Lachlan Shaw glanced at Fiona, concern and something deeper flickering across his face. Alistair rose abruptly, knocking his chair backwards. "I'll contest it, duress, undue influence," he glared at Fiona. "You knew, didn't you? You persuaded him in his weakness." Fiona met his gaze steadily. "I knew nothing of the change until this moment. Mr. MacLeod made his own decisions, as always." "Liar!" Alistair spat, then turned on his heel and stormed from the room, slamming the door behind him. Mr. Campbell gathered his papers with unruffled calm. "The will is watertight, I assure you. Good day to you all." He departed, leaving tension thick as loom dust in the air. Poirot remained seated, observing each reaction with keen interest. Greed thwarted. Ambition unexpectedly rewarded. Justice perhaps tardily granted, and love complicated. Morag Kerr was the first to speak. "I never thought he'd do right by us, not after all the battles." "People surprise us, madame," Poirot said softly, "even in death." Fiona rose with quiet dignity. "If you'll excuse me, Monsieur Poirot, I have arrangements to make." Lachlan Shaw moved instinctively toward her, then checked himself. "Fiona, Miss Drummond, if there's anything—" She gave him a brief, strained smile. "Thank you, Lachlan. Later, perhaps." They left separately, Morag with a purposeful stride, Shaw lingering as though reluctant to abandon the field. Poirot walked to the window and watched the yard below. Alistair Baird emerged from the main door moments later, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. He paced furiously, then suddenly hurled the cigarette away and strode toward the side gate. But not before glancing up, directly at the boardroom window, as though sensing Poirot's gaze upon him. Their eyes met across the distance. Alistair's were wild with rage and fear. Poirot inclined his head gravely. That evening, as Poirot sat in his suite at the Central Hotel reviewing notes, a white envelope was slipped beneath his door. No footstep announced its arrival, only the faint rustle of paper on carpet. He opened it carefully. Typed in the same uneven capitals as the earlier notes, "Stop poking or you'll be next." The bolt was only the beginning. Poirot turned the paper to the gaslight, examining watermark and texture. Cheap commercial stock, available by the ream in any stationer's shop. He placed it in an envelope beside the others, then permitted himself a small smile. The killer grows nervous, he murmured. Bon, it is when the criminal begins to threaten Hercule Poirot that he makes his first serious mistake. Outside, Glasgow's bells tolled 7 o'clock through the rain-soaked darkness. Somewhere in the city, a murderer calculated risks and weighed chances. But the little grey cells were already 3 moves ahead. And the game, Poirot reflected with satisfaction, was entering its most fascinating phase. Chapter 6. The Broken Alibi. The weaving hall had never felt so alive as it did at 17 minutes past 9 on that cold December morning. Hercule Poirot had insisted upon a full reconstruction, and the mill hummed with reluctant activity. Dozens of workers stood at their stations, pretending to prepare the looms while stealing curious glances at the little Belgian detective, who moved among them like a precise, neatly dressed cat. The great overhead shafts turned slowly, driven by the basement engine at half speed to simulate the moment just before full start-up. Belts creaked and flapped gently. The air carried the familiar scents of warm oil and damp wool. Poirot stood in the centre of the fatal aisle, pocket watch in hand. Around him, at a respectful distance, waited the 4 principals. Fiona Drummond by her office door, Morag Kerr among a group of weavers, Alistair Baird lounging against a pillar with affected boredom, and Lachlan Shaw near the engine room hatch. Inspector McAllister observed from the gallery above. At precisely 17 minutes past 9 yesterday, Poirot announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, Monsieur MacLeod walked this path alone. The looms had not yet begun their full rhythm. Vibration was minimal, and yet a 60-pound bolt fell with deadly accuracy. He began to walk the chalked route himself, counting softly under his breath. At the fatal spot he paused dramatically. Now, we shall hear where each of you claims to have been. He turned first to Fiona Drummond. Mademoiselle, you were in your office, preparing schedules? She nodded. Yes, the door was open. I heard the impact. Poirot inclined his head. Mrs. Kerr, with my girls in the spinning room. We were piecing threads. Half a dozen can confirm it. Mr. Baird? Alistair smirked. Saracen's Head Tavern, across the river. Breakfasting with Captain Forrester and young McCrae. Ask them. And Mr. Shaw? Boiler room, checking steam pressure. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Almost admirable alibis, except... He beckoned to a small boy in a ragged cap who hovered near the main doors, a delivery lad from the grocer's across the street. Come, mon petit, tell these good people what you told me this morning. The boy shuffled forward, twisting his cap nervously. I saw Mr. Baird, sir, near the mill gate at 9:05 yesterday. He was smoking, looking up at the windows like he was waiting for someone. Then he went inside. Alistair's face darkened. The boy's mistaken. No, Poirot interrupted gently. You came back briefly, did you not? Perhaps to retrieve your cigarette case, as you claimed earlier. But the Saracen's Head is 20 minutes' walk across the bridge. You could not have been in both places. Alistair opened his mouth and then closed it again. Poirot moved to a workbench and picked up a heavy spanner. Observe. He climbed the iron ladder nimbly and, on the gallery, demonstrated how the tool could be used to loosen 3 of the 4 brackets supporting a bolt shelf. Not enough to cause immediate collapse, oh no! Merely enough that when the looms begin their vibration... He descended and nodded to the engine man. The shafts accelerated slightly. A low rumble filled the hall. From the loosened shelf above, now holding only a dummy bolt of similar weight, dust sifted down. Delayed action, Poirot said. Clever. The killer loosens the brackets days earlier. Then, on the fatal morning, ensures the bolt sits upon the very edge. A passing lorry, the starting engine, anything might trigger it. He turned to the group. But this requires intimate knowledge. The exact weight of each bolt, the precise balance, the knowledge that Monsieur MacLeod walked this path every single morning at exactly 17 minutes past 9. His lifelong habit, known to all who worked closely with him. All eyes turned involuntarily to Fiona Drummond. She paled but held her ground. I kept his diary for 15 years. Yes, I knew his routines, but I did not kill him. Perhaps not directly, Poirot said softly, but someone who wished to protect you might have feared for your position. The new looms would reduce your responsibilities, no? Or someone jealous of the closeness between you and the victim. Lachlan Shaw took a half-step forward, fists clenched. Leave her out of this. Poirot regarded him with sudden intensity. You checked the racks a week ago, monsieur. You would know exactly how to loosen them without immediate detection. And you are devoted to Miss Drummond, are you not? Devoted enough to remove the man you believed threatened her future, or who rejected her affection. Shaw's face flushed deep red. I'd never. Yet the evidence accumulates, Poirot continued relentlessly. The brass button from your work jacket, found beneath the ladder. The footprints in oil matching your boots. Your solitary presence in the boiler room. No witness. Fiona turned to Shaw, eyes wide with sudden fear. Lachlan, no. Alistair Baird gave a short, triumphant laugh. Well, well, the quiet ones, eh? Morag Kerr shook her head slowly. I fought MacLeod openly all my life. I'd not have wished this on him, or on any of us. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, watching each face. The engine rumbled on, belts slapping rhythmically overhead like slow applause. Then he spoke again, almost gently. The case against Mr. Shaw appears overwhelming, and convenient. He signalled, and the engine slowed to silence once more. But Hercule Poirot is not satisfied with convenience. Too many clues point in one direction, like signposts arranged by a careful hand. The button too obviously placed. The footprints too clearly marked. No mes amis. When the criminal makes the path to guilt so plain, often it is because he wishes us to follow it, away from the true route. He turned to Inspector McAllister on the gallery. Arrest Mr. Shaw if you must, Inspector, but keep him safe, for I believe he is in greater danger than he knows. Shaw stared at Poirot in confusion. Fiona reached out as if to touch his arm, then withdrew her hand. Outside, the rain had begun again, drumming upon the high windows like impatient fingers. And somewhere in the vast hall, hidden among the silent looms and stacked tartans, the real killer permitted himself a small, satisfied breath. Chapter 7. The false trail night had settled heavily over Glasgow, and the Caledonian Textile Mills stood dark save for a single lamp burning in the weaving hall. Inspector McAllister had acted swiftly upon Poirot's suggestion. Lachlan Shaw was taken to the station for questioning and held overnight. The evidence, the brass button, the oil footprints, the drafts of threatening notes discovered in a search of his lodgings appeared conclusive. By morning, the newspapers would carry headlines of an arrest in the Tartan Bolt murder. Yet Hercule Poirot was far from content. He sat alone in his hotel sitting room, the gas fire hissing softly, a small table before him laid with the physical clues. The brass button in its envelope, the anonymous notes, the crude drawing from the notice board, the bookmaker's bill for Alistair Baird. He arranged them in a precise row, then leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes half closed. Too much, he murmured to himself. Far too much. When the criminal scatters clues so generously, he is like the conjurer who waves one hand to distract from the other. No, this is mise en scène, a stage set for our convenience. He rose and donned his overcoat, hat and gloves. A taxicab conveyed him through empty, rain-slicked streets back to the silent mill. The night watchman, forewarned by McAllister, admitted him without question. The weaving hall felt different in the small hours, vast and echoing, the looms looming like ancient monoliths under the faint glow of a single lamp Poirot carried. He moved directly to the iron ladder and climbed once more to the storage gallery, his patent leather shoes ringing softly on the metal rungs. By the light of a pocket torch, he examined the repaired shelf where the fatal bolt had rested. The mill's carpenters had replaced the loosened brackets that afternoon, painting them fresh black. But Poirot was not interested in the new paint. He lay prone upon the narrow walkway, an undignified posture he adopted only when necessity demanded, and peered closely at the underside of the shelf. There, almost invisible against the dark iron, was a thin scratch in the new paint. A straight, shallow groove, no longer than 3 inches, ending in a tiny burr where something fine had been tied and then pulled free. Poirot's breath emerged in a soft exclamation of satisfaction. "Un ficelle," he whispered. "A string, or better, a fishing line. Strong, thin, almost invisible among the warp threads below." He descended carefully and stood beneath the shelf, visualizing. A line tied to the bolt on the loosened brackets led down through the mechanisms of the loom directly below, then across the floor to a hiding place among the silent machines. A sharp tug at the precise moment MacLeod passed beneath, and the bolt would topple outward, falling straight and true. Not an accident triggered by vibration, not even sabotage relying on chance. A deliberate, timed execution, and that required presence in the hall at 17 minutes past 9. Someone hidden, watching, waiting for the victim to reach the exact spot. Poirot walked the aisle again, eyes scanning the floor. In the shadow of a large warping frame, he found what he sought. A tiny nick in the wooden boards, as though something sharp had been wedged there to anchor the line. And nearby, caught on a splinter, a single translucent strand, fishing gut, strong enough to bear 60 pounds for a moment. He secured it in an envelope. "Maintenant," he said softly, "the picture changes." Lachlan Shaw could not have pulled the line from the boiler room. Fiona Drummond's office door commanded no view of the fatal spot. Morag Kerr had been surrounded by witnesses in the spinning room. Only one person had claimed an alibi that placed him far from the mill, yet had been seen returning only minutes before the death. Alistair Baird. Greed had driven him. £8,000 of gambling debt, a will newly changed to cut him out almost entirely. He had loosened the brackets days earlier during one of his visits, rigged the line, returned on the fatal morning under pretense of a forgotten cigarette case, hidden among the looms, waited, pulled, then, in panic or cunning, begun planting evidence against Shaw. The button torn from a spare jacket in the locker room, the oil deliberately tracked, the note drafts taken from Morag's union files, all to direct suspicion toward a man whose only crime was quiet devotion to Fiona Drummond. Poirot extinguished his lamp and stood in the darkness, listening to the building settle around him. The creak of cooling iron, the drip of rainwater from a leaky gutter, the faint sigh of wind through high vents. "The false trail is laid," he murmured, "but Hercule Poirot follows only the true one." He left as silently as he had come, locking the great doors behind him. Tomorrow he would gather them all once more. Tomorrow the net would close. For the moment, he permitted himself a small, satisfied, Twitch of the moustaches. The little grey cells had spoken. Chapter 8. The mathematics of murder dawn broke cold and clear over the Clyde, the first pale light in many days, unfiltered by rain. The weaving hall of Caledonian Textile Mills filled slowly with summoned figures, workers at their stations out of curiosity as much as duty. Inspector McAllister, with 2 constables by the doors, and the 4 principals assembled beneath the repaired storage gallery. Lachlan Shaw had been released at first light, and now stood beside Fiona Drummond, his face haggard but defiant. Morag Kerr watched everything with folded arms. Alistair Baird arrived last, lighting a cigarette with elaborate nonchalance. Hercule Poirot waited in the centre of the fatal aisle, a replica bolt of tartan, 60 pounds exactly, at his feet. In his gloved hands he held a length of fine fishing line. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice ringing clear in the vast space, "we have played a fascinating game these past days. A game of accident and murder, of greed and devotion, of false trails and planted clues. But today, the little grey cells declare the game ended." He gestured upward to the shelf. "From the beginning, this death was too perfect for accident. A heavy bolt falls straight down, striking Monsieur MacLeod precisely upon the crown. 1 foot to either side, and he lives. Such precision demands planning." Alistair gave a short laugh. "You've said all this before, monsieur, and your planning pointed to Shaw here." "Précisément," Poirot replied mildly. "It pointed because it was intended to point. The brass button torn from a spare jacket and dropped conveniently. Footprints in oil tracked with care. Drafts of threatening notes stolen from Mrs. Kerr's files and hidden in Mr. Shaw's lodgings. All most obliging." Shaw stirred angrily, but Poirot raised a hand. "Patience, monsieur. You were chosen as scapegoat because you are quiet, devoted to Miss Drummond, and conveniently alone at the critical moment. A man whose motive, protecting the woman he loves from loss of position or from rejection, could be made plausible." Fiona turned white. Shaw's jaw tightened. Poirot continued, but the true mechanism was more ingenious. Not mere loosening of brackets awaiting vibration. Non. A fishing line, strong, thin, almost invisible, tied to the bolt on its loosened shelf, threaded down through the loom below, anchored across the floor to a hiding place among the machines. He demonstrated swiftly, looping the line around the replica bolt, leading it down and across the aisle. A sharp tug at the exact moment the victim passes beneath, and the bolt falls outward, straight and true, timed to the second, requiring presence here in this hall at 17 minutes past 9. He turned to Alistair Baird. "You, monsieur, claim to be across the river at the Saracen's Head. Yet the delivery boy saw you return. You entered quietly, hid among the looms, waited for your uncle's habitual passage, and pulled." Alistair crushed out his cigarette with sudden violence. "Rubbish! You've no proof." "Au contraire," Poirot said softly. "Proof is in the mathematics of murder. The shelf brackets were loosened days earlier, during one of your frequent visits pleading for money. The line rigged the night before. On the fatal morning you returned, having established your alibi earlier, with friends who believed you remained. You watched, you tugged. Then, in the confusion after the alarm, you planted the first false clues." He produced the envelopes, the fishing gut strand, the nick in the floorboard, the scratch in the fresh paint. Small things, perhaps, but to Hercule Poirot they speak loudly. Alistair's composure cracked. "You can't prove I was here. But I can prove you needed money desperately. £8,000 owed, a new will cutting you to a pittance. And I can prove the clues against Mr. Shaw were fabricated. The button thread was fresh torn, not worn. The oil footprints too evenly spaced, made by someone walking backwards in borrowed boots. the note drafts in your own handwriting beneath the typing. Morag Kerr gasped. My drafts, stolen from the union drawer 2 days ago. Exactly, madame. Returned to incriminate another. Alistair looked around wildly, seeking escape, but the constables blocked the doors. It was meant to be an accident, he burst out at last, voice shaking. Only to frighten him, make him advance me the money. I didn't mean the bolt to fall so hard. But when it did, it solved everything, or should have. He laughed suddenly, a brittle sound. Uncle always said I lacked backbone. Perhaps he was right. Inspector McAllister stepped forward. Alistair Hamish Baird, I arrest you for the murder of Hamish Alistair MacLeod. The handcuffs clicked shut. Fiona turned away, eyes closed. Shaw moved instinctively to support her, then stopped, uncertain of his welcome. Morag Kerr watched in silence, face unreadable. Alistair was led out into the pale morning light. Head bowed now, the fight gone from him. Poirot stood alone beneath the high racks, looking up at the empty space where death had fallen. Greed, he said quietly, almost to himself. Always greed. It makes men clever, and then it makes them fools. The looms remained silent a little longer, as though in respect. Then, slowly, the great engine rumbled to life below. Belts began to turn, and the hall filled once more with the ancient rhythmic thunder of honest work. Chapter 9. Confession. The pale morning light strengthened, spilling through the high windows of the weaving hall, and turning the stacked bolts of tartan into towers of muted crimson, green, and blue. The air still carried the faint metallic tang of yesterday's drama, but the rhythmic hum of the looms had not yet resumed. The workers lingered at the edges, sensing that the story was not quite finished. Alistair Baird stood between the two constables, handcuffs glinting on his wrists. The bravado that had sustained him for days had drained away, leaving his handsome face drawn and strangely young. He no longer met anyone's eyes. Inspector McAllister completed the formal caution with quiet efficiency. You'll be taken to the station now, Mr. Baird. Anything you say may be used in evidence. Alistair gave a small, bitter nod. Then, unexpectedly, he looked up, directly at Hercule Poirot. It wasn't meant to go this far, he said, his voice cracking on the words. You have to believe that. Poirot regarded him steadily, head tilted in that familiar bird-like fashion. Then tell us, monsieur. Tell us how it was meant to go. Alistair glanced at the silent faces around him. Fiona's pale and averted, Shaw's hard with contempt, Morag Kerr's grimly satisfied, and something in him seemed to collapse. I only wanted to frighten him, he repeated, more softly now. Uncle Hamish had refused me again. Another final refusal. £8,000 to the bookmakers by the end of the month, or they'd send men round. He knew. He'd paid smaller debts before, but this time he said I had to learn. Said he was changing the will to force me to reform. He laughed, a short, hollow sound. So I thought, if something happened, something that looked like an accident, he might be shaken enough to advance me the money, just enough to keep me safe. I'd watched Lachlan check the racks. I knew how the brackets worked. It seemed simple. Loosen 3, leave the bolt teetering. A vibration would send it down. He'd be bruised, frightened, nothing more. Then I'd rush to his side, the devoted nephew, and he'd see I was all he had. His voice grew steadier as he spoke, as though confession itself brought a kind of relief. I did the loosening 3 nights earlier, after he'd gone home, used a spanner from the tool store, then rigged the fishing line. My father taught me to fish as a boy. I threaded it through the loom harnesses so it wouldn't be seen, planned to tug gently, just enough to tip the bolt over the edge. Thought it would fall short, land in front with a crash. He swallowed hard. But I miscalculated the balance, or the line pulled harder than I intended. When he walked underneath at exactly 17 minutes past 9, like clockwork every day, I tugged, and it came straight down. The sound? He closed his eyes briefly. There was no cry, just that awful thud. I ran out from behind the looms, shouting for help like everyone else. No one noticed me at first in the panic. Then I saw my chance, saw how it could look like pure accident, or, if suspicion arose, how I could turn it towards shore. Fiona made a small, involuntary sound of distress. Shore's arm half rose as though to comfort her, then fell again. Alistair continued, words tumbling now. Took the button from Shore's spare jacket in the locker room. Everyone leaves them hanging. Tracked oil with his boots. Stole Morag's note drafts. I thought if the police had an obvious suspect, they'd stop looking. And I'd inherit after all, because who would suspect the grieving heir? He looked at Poirot again, almost pleading. But you saw through it all. Poirot inclined his head gravely. One cannot deceive the little grey cells indefinitely, monsieur. They have a habit of arranging even chaos into order. Morag Kerr spoke for the first time, her voice rough with suppressed emotion. A man's dead, lad. A hard man, aye, but one who'd worked his way up from nothing, and you killed him for gambling debts. Alistair flinched as though struck. Fiona turned away entirely, pressing a hand to her mouth. Shaw watched her with helpless pain, then looked at Alistair with something colder than hatred, pity perhaps. The constables moved forward. Alistair offered no resistance as they guided him toward the doors. At the threshold, he paused once more. Tell my uncle's portrait in the boardroom. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him he was right about me all along. Then he was gone, footsteps echoing down the corridor until the outer door closed with finality. Silence settled over the hall, broken only by the distant cry of gulls along the Clyde. Poirot stood motionless for a long moment, gazing at the empty space where the fatal bolt had fallen. Then he adjusted his hat and turned to the others. Justice, mes amis, is sometimes a heavy thing, but it falls where it must. He walked toward the exit with his usual neat precision, pausing only to lay a gentle hand on Fiona's arm. Courage, mademoiselle. The mill endures, and perhaps, under wiser hands, it will thrive. Outside, the winter sun climbed higher, glinting on wet cobblestones and the slow brown waters of the river. Chapter 10. Order restored. The winter sun hung low over the Clyde, a pale disk in a sky washed clean by days of rain. From the gates of Caledonia, textile mills rose the steady familiar thunder of the looms, full-throated now, unbroken, as though the building itself had drawn a deep breath and returned to life. Hercule Poirot stood on the cobblestones of the yard, valise in hand, watching the last wisps of steam curl from the engine-house chimney. The mill had resumed work that very morning. Fiona Drummond and Morag Kerr, uneasy partners under the terms of the new will, had together addressed the workforce at the shift change. There would be no mass dismissals. The new electric looms would still come, but slowly, with retraining, severance, and profit-sharing. Hamish MacLeod's final, surprising act of conscience would be honoured. Inspector McAllister emerged from the main door and approached hat in hand. Monsieur Poirot, the car's ready to take you to Central Station. Edinburgh train leaves in an hour. Poirot inclined his head. You are most kind, Inspector. But one small moment more, if you please. He turned back toward the building. Workers passed him with respectful nods. Some of the older weavers touched their caps. Word of how the little foreign detective had unravelled the tangle of greed and falsehood had spread quickly through the close-knit community. Fiona Drummond appeared at the office window above, catching sight of him. She hesitated, then came down the iron stairs. Lachlan Shaw followed a few paces behind, as though uncertain of his welcome. "Monsieur Poirot," Fiona said, extending a gloved hand. Her face was pale, composure hard-won. We owe you more than words can repay. The truth, however painful, is better than suspicion poisoning everything." Poirot took her hand gently. "Mademoiselle, you have a difficult task ahead, bridging old ways and new, management and workers. But I see in you the strength required. And perhaps," his eyes flicked briefly to Shaw, "an ally who shares your vision." Shaw coloured slightly, but met Poirot's gaze steadily. "I'll do whatever's needed, Miss Drummond. The mill's been my life these 20 years. Fiona's severe expression softened. "Then let us begin again, Lachlan, properly this time." Morag Kerr joined them, shawl about her shoulders despite the pale sunshine. "I never thought I'd say it, but MacLeod did right in the end. And you, monsieur, you gave us the chance to prove we can do better than he ever believed." Poirot smiled, a small, satisfied curve beneath the magnificent moustaches. "Order is restored, madame. That is the greatest satisfaction Hercule Poirot can ask." McAllister cleared his throat. "Alistair Baird made a full statement this morning. No resistance. The Procurator Fiscal's office will proceed swiftly." Poirot nodded. "A wasted life, but the mill endures. And that, I think, is what Monsieur MacLeod truly wished, even if he could not bring himself to trust others with it." He turned toward the waiting car, then paused one final time at the gates. Looking back, he saw the great red brick building bathed in cold, clear light. Windows glinting, smoke rising straight and true, the rhythmic clack of the looms drifting out like a heartbeat. "The Tartan bolt fell heavily, mes amis," he said softly, almost to himself. "Greed falls heavier still, but truth falls heaviest of all. And when it lands, everything is set in its proper place." He raised his hat in a small, courteous salute to the group on the steps, then climbed into the car. As the vehicle pulled away along the riverside road, Poirot permitted himself a private moment of reflection. Another case concluded. Another pattern, chaotic at first, reduced to perfect symmetry by the little grey cells. The train awaited. Edinburgh, then London, then perhaps a brief rest in his perfectly ordered flat, where the hot chocolate would be precisely as he liked. It and no bolts of tartan threatened to disturb the peace. Hercule Poirot leaned back against the leather seat, closed his eyes, and allowed the gentle motion of the car to lull him. Order restored. The world, for the moment, was in balance.